So how do we understand what is happening to Joe Biden in regard to all these records they're finding in different locations and the fact that now it's giving Republicans a talking point to create an obviously false equivalency with what happened to Trump in the Mar-a-Lago records scandal? The way to do it is to go to astrological first principles. So we look at a natural wheel with Aries as the first sign, Taurus as the second, Pisces 12, etc. Gemini, third sign, and Mercury. That is where records are found. So this will apply to Mercury in any chart, Gemini in any chart, and the third sign in any chart. To pretty much perfectly illustrate this, we turn first to the chart for the Mar-a-Lago cockroach to show two planets resident in the third, Jupiter and Neptune. And we know that Neptune is a very complicated planet by being in a T-square, which means it opposes Eris and squares Mercury. Mercury, remember, we said, is a records planet. So we have planet resident in the third sign squaring Mercury. One instance right there of doubling down on the theme. Now Neptune circulates in transit and currently finds itself squaring the sun and the moon, which it has been doing for quite some time, but can definitely bring up that topic if the person has done something like that. This doesn't mean that you would get a record scandal if your Neptune is doing something similar. It takes an idiot like this to make a situation like this happen. And so the Neptune is challenging. Jupiter, which comes from that same sign, you'll recall last year when the FBI raided his Mar-a-Lago home to get those records out because he wouldn't return them, Jupiter was transiting through the T-square, essentially lighting it up, which is what you see in astrology. When you take a formation and you put a planet in there that relates to something, that's when things happen. That Jupiter comes from this house, place of records, the third. And indeed, you'll notice that Jupiter is going to return to those degrees one more time, late January and into February, at the same time as Saturn is opposing his Mars. So this issue is very likely to resurface again, for sure, but you also know that in his chart it's perfectly illustrated by what his planets are telling you, and it is not a good message. In fact, I can add the fact that what is the ruler of the third? Venus. Venus in the 12th next to Saturn, that's already a problem, but moreover, Jupiter squares it, and Venus has been getting all kinds of trouble from Pluto opposing it. And so that's another problematic angle and links him to this particular topic in a way that is very, very difficult. When we look at Biden's chart, it's explained as well because Saturn currently is in Aquarius, his third sign. That's the sign of records. Indeed, Saturn at birth is in Gemini, which is the sign of records, and it's the first ruler of that house, so it links it to that as well. And Uranus as the co-ruler is also in Gemini, and also links it to that house. So at the moment, Saturn is squaring his Mercury. It was actually a little while ago. Now it's going to square his Sun and his Venus as we look in here, moving toward March 10th, when Saturn will be exiting and into Pisces. Problem is, of course, in the early Pisces degrees, it still has to square this Uranus. So this would tell us that this issue is likely to start to become less of a factor by mid-April or so when Saturn reaches degrees that are beyond this Uranus. However, there is a pretty good possibility it'll remain further into the future and show up at different times all the way into the spring of 24 because that is when it will get beyond the degrees of Saturn. In here, by the time it gets to 12 or so degrees, it's past this Saturn by square and no longer aggravates anything in any kind of significant way. So there's no real comparison between this chart and this chart. First of all, because we all know that in the case of Biden, he is returning the records through his own volition. People in his orbit are finding them and returning them. In the case of this guy, he was refusing to return them, thereby engaging in obstruction of justice, and then they had to raid the place in order to get them back. And so there is no equivalency here. Moreover, if you said, well, perhaps Biden did something really wrong and there's a possibility he could be charged, fine. But by that logic, when this buffoon was president, he wasn't charged because he was president. So by the same logic, Biden may get in some kind of trouble, but you can't really do anything until he leaves the presidency. However, I don't think that's really it. I think that there simply isn't enough in this chart for this records issue to get a grip the way it does in this chart. And furthermore, with this chart and with individual number 1 here, there is more than just these records as we move into January, February, March, and deeper into 2023. This guy has multiple legal problems swirling around him. And so he may even get to the point where the records are the least of it. But I would be very, very surprised if Garland and Smith and DOJ prosecutors stop themselves from charging him in regard to the Mar-a-Lago records because of what is happening with Biden. Deeply skeptical of that argument.